At the Miller family's monthly Sunday dinner in Riverside, Ohio, my sister-in-law Rebecca unwrapped what she called her special gift for me in front of the entire family. Inside the decorative box was a plastic security badge and a child's whistle. "Since you're so passionate about your security work, Jess," she announced with a saccharine smile, "I thought you could use some proper equipment." The table erupted in uncomfortable laughter as she continued her performance. "Maybe now you can finally get that promotion from mall security to actual rent-a-cop." Just as the humiliation reached its peak, and I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment, the doorbell rang. David went to answer it, and returned with Detective Sarah Chen from the Riverside Police Department. "I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner," she said, scanning the room until her eyes found mine. "But Detective Miller, we need you immediately. The Henderson case just broke wide open. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The silence that followed Detective Chen's words was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Rebecca's fork clattered against her plate as her confident smirk dissolved into confusion. Patricia Miller, my mother-in-law, stopped mid-chew of her famous apple pie, while my father-in-law Bob nearly choked on his coffee. The only sound was Tommy, David's younger brother, whispering, "Did she just say detective?" to his girlfriend Lisa, who looked as bewildered as everyone else at the table. My name is Jessica Miller, though everyone at this table has spent the last 3 years calling me Jess, in that particular tone that somehow manages to sound both condescending and dismissive. I married David Miller when I was 25, fresh out of the police academy, and already 2 years into my career with the Riverside Police Department. David knew exactly what I did for a living when we met at a community coffee shop where I was grabbing lunch between shifts. He'd been charmed by my stories about police work, impressed by my dedication to justice, and proud to introduce me to his friends as his girlfriend, who was making a real difference in their community. But somewhere between our engagement and our first family dinner as a married couple, the narrative had shifted. David's older sister Rebecca had taken one look at me, heard that I worked in security, and immediately decided I wasn't worthy of her baby brother. She'd convinced herself, and gradually the rest of the family, that I was some sort of low-level security guard, probably working at the local shopping mall or maybe doing overnight shifts at an office building. The fact that I couldn't always talk about my work in detail only reinforced her assumptions. After all, what kind of impressive career requires you to be vague about your daily activities? The truth was far more complex than Rebecca's limited imagination could grasp. I wasn't just a police officer. I was a detective in the organized crime division, specifically specializing in financial fraud and money laundering cases. My work often required me to go undercover, which meant maintaining a low profile even in my personal life. When family members asked about my job, I'd learned to give generic answers about security consulting and investigating irregularities, because the alternative was either lying outright or potentially compromising ongoing investigations. For 3 years, I'd endured Rebecca's passive-aggressive comments about my career. She'd introduced me to her friends as David's wife, who does some kind of security work, with emphasis that made it sound like I checked IDs at nightclub doors. During family gatherings, she'd make jokes about me needing to work my way up the security ladder, or suggest that David could help me find something more stable through his connections at the bank. The worst part wasn't even Rebecca's behavior. It was watching David squirm uncomfortably, but never quite finding the courage to correct his sister's misconceptions. I'd tried to address it directly once, about 18 months into our marriage. Rebecca had made another comment about how some people are just meant for different kinds of work, and I'd attempted to explain that my job was actually quite demanding and required extensive training. She'd laughed and patted my hand like I was a child trying to convince adults that my finger painting was real art. "Oh, honey," she'd said, "we all have to start somewhere. I'm sure you'll find your niche eventually." The condescension was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. After that, I'd made a conscious decision to stop trying to correct the record. If Rebecca wanted to believe I was some low-level security guard, that was her choice. I had more important things to worry about than managing my sister-in-law's opinion of my career. Besides, there was something almost liberating about being underestimated. Nobody expected much from me at family gatherings, which meant I could observe the dynamics without being thrust into the center of every conversation. But today had been different from the start. I'd arrived at the Miller family home on Maple Street feeling unusually drained. I'd been working the Henderson case for 6 months, a complex financial fraud investigation involving several marketing agencies in the greater Riverside area. We'd discovered a sophisticated money laundering operation that used legitimate businesses as fronts, and I'd spent the last 2 weeks going through financial records that would have bored most people to tears. The case was finally coming together, but it had required long hours and careful coordination with multiple agencies. David had noticed my exhaustion during the drive to his parents' house. "You've been working so much lately," he'd said, reaching over to squeeze my hand at a red light. "I know you can't talk about it, but I hope whatever case you're on wraps up soon. You look like you haven't slept in days." He was right. The Henderson investigation had consumed my life for weeks. Captain Rodriguez had assigned me as the lead detective because of my background in financial crimes, and the pressure to get it right was enormous. We were dealing with millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions, and several prominent local businesses were potentially involved, the kind of case that could make or break a detective's career. But sitting at the Miller family dining table, surrounded by Patricia's good china and the smell of her pot roast, I'd tried to push work from my mind and focus on being present for family time. Patricia had outdone herself with dinner, and even Bob had made an effort to ask me about my week, though he'd phrased it as asking about my security work in that same tone everyone used. Rebecca had been unusually quiet during the main course, which should have been my first warning sign. She typically dominated family conversations with stories about her job at Henderson Marketing Agency, where she worked as a senior account executive. Today, however, she'd seemed distracted, almost nervous. She'd mentioned that work had been challenging lately and that their industry was going through some changes, but she'd deflected when Bob asked for specifics. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Marketing agencies came and went, and Rebecca had always been dramatic about workplace stress. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What I couldn't have known was that her unusual behavior was connected to my own investigation in ways that would soon become uncomfortably clear. The cruel joke with the fake security badge had come during dessert, just as everyone was relaxed and comfortable. Rebecca had disappeared into the kitchen while Patricia served pie, claiming she needed to get something from her purse. When she returned, she was carrying a small gift box wrapped in silver paper with an elaborate bow. "I have a little something. For Jessica," she'd announced, setting the box in front of me with theatrical flourish. "I saw this and immediately thought of you." David had looked surprised. Rebecca never gave me gifts outside of Christmas and birthdays, and those were typically generic items like candles or bath products that felt more like obligations than genuine gestures. I'd felt a flutter of hope that maybe she was finally ready to make an effort at building a better relationship. The hope had lasted exactly as long as it took me to open the box and see the plastic badge and whistle nestled in tissue paper. The badge was obviously a toy, the kind you might buy at a dollar store for a child playing dress-up. It said, "Security," in bold letters across a shield design that looked like it had been stamped out of cheap plastic. The whistle was even worse. It was bright orange and had a cartoon character printed on the side. "I thought these might help with your career development," Rebecca had said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Every security professional needs the right tools." The laughter that followed hadn't been malicious from most of the family members. They'd seemed more uncomfortable than amused. But Rebecca had basked in what she clearly viewed as her comedic triumph, launching into an elaborate explanation of how she'd carefully selected each item based on my professional needs. "The badge has a clip on the back," she'd pointed out helpfully, "so you can attach it to your uniform. And the whistle has a nice loud sound that should really help when you need to get someone's attention in the parking lot." I'd felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger, but I'd managed to maintain my composure. Years of police training had taught me to control my emotional reactions, even in situations where I wanted nothing more than to defend myself. I'd simply said, "Thank you, Rebecca," in a level voice, and set the items aside. That's when she'd delivered the final blow about the promotion from mall security to rent-a-cop, and the table had erupted in that awful, uncomfortable laughter. Even Lisa, who barely knew me, had giggled nervously, probably feeling pressure to fit in with her boyfriend's family dynamics. But then the doorbell had rung, and everything changed. David had looked annoyed at the interruption, checking his watch as he got up from the table. Who could that be on a Sunday afternoon? He'd muttered, wiping his mouth with his napkin before heading to the front door. I'd heard voices in the hallway, one of which I'd recognized immediately as Detective Sarah Chen's. My stomach had dropped as I realized what this meant. Sarah wouldn't have come to the Miller house on a Sunday unless something major had happened. With one of our cases, the Henderson investigation was the only thing big enough to warrant an emergency consultation. When David had returned with Sarah in tow, I'd seen the exact moment when she'd taken in the scene. Her trained detective's eye had scanned the faces around the table, noted the tension in the air, and observed the plastic badge and whistle sitting in front of me like evidence of some elaborate prank. "I'm sorry to interrupt your dinner," she'd said with professional courtesy, though I could see the confusion in her expression as she tried to understand what she'd walked into. "But Detective Miller, we need you immediately. The Henderson case just broke wide open." The words had hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming the entire atmosphere of the room in an instant. I could feel every eye at the table, turning toward me, could sense the collective mental recalibration happening as my family members tried to process what they'd just heard. Detective Miller. Not security guard Jessica, not mall cop Jess, not the woman who needed plastic badges and toy whistles to advance her career. Detective Miller, being summoned by another police officer for an emergency consultation on what was obviously a significant case. Rebecca's face had gone through several distinct phases of expression in the span of about 5 seconds. First, confusion, as if she'd misheard. Then disbelief, as if this had to be some kind of mistake. Finally, something that looked suspiciously like panic, though I couldn't understand why at the time. "There must be some mistake," Rebecca had said, her voice strained and higher than usual. "This is Jessica Miller. She works in security, basic security." Sarah had looked at Rebecca with the polite patience that police officers reserved for civilians who were clearly confused about a situation they didn't understand. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Chen from the Riverside Police Department. I've been working with Detective Miller on a major financial fraud investigation for the past 6 months. We're partners." The word partners had landed like a bomb in the center of the dining room table. I'd watched David's face transform as he finally began to understand the full scope of what his family had been getting wrong about my career. His mother, Patricia, had actually gasped, a small sound of surprise that she'd immediately tried to cover with her napkin. Bob had sat back in his chair as if someone had pushed him, his eyes wide with shock. But it was Tommy's reaction that had surprised me the most. David's youngest brother had suddenly straightened up in his chair, his eyes bright with what looked like excitement. "Wait," he'd said, looking between Sarah and me. "Jess is actually a detective? Like, a real detective? She's one of the best financial crime investigators in the department," Sarah had confirmed, and I'd felt a flush of pride at the genuine respect in her voice. "Detective Miller has been leading the Henderson investigation. We've been tracking a sophisticated money laundering operation for months." At the mention of the Henderson investigation, I'd noticed Rebecca's face go completely pale. She'd gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and for a moment I'd thought she might actually faint. "Henderson?" she'd whispered, and there had been something in her voice that made my detective instincts suddenly sharpen. "You know," I'd said slowly, studying Rebecca's face with new attention, "Henderson Marketing Agency is one of the businesses we've been investigating. We have reason to believe they've been used as a front for money laundering operations." The one silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted Sarah's arrival. This was the heavy, charged silence that comes when everyone in the room suddenly realizes they're in the middle of something much bigger and more complicated than they'd understood. Rebecca had opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Her face had gone from pale to slightly green, and she'd looked like she was having trouble breathing. "Rebecca," David had said carefully, "you work at Henderson Marketing Agency." It wasn't a question, and the implication hung heavy in the air between us. I'd found myself studying my sister-in-law with professional detachment, noting details I'd never paid attention to before. Her expensive handbag, which seemed inconsistent with what I knew about marketing salaries in Riverside. The designer shoes she'd been wearing, which I'd vaguely noticed but not really thought about. The nervous energy she'd been displaying all afternoon, which I'd attributed to general workplace stress. "I need to speak with Detective Miller privately," Sarah had said, her voice taking on the formal tone that meant we were moving from social situation to official police business. "We have developments that require immediate attention." I'd stood up from the table, acutely aware that everyone was watching my every movement. The plastic badge and whistle were still sitting where Rebecca had placed them, now looking almost absurd in the context of what had just been revealed. The cruel joke that had seemed so devastating just minutes earlier had been transformed into something almost laughable. "Of course," I'd said to Sarah, my own voice shifting into professional mode. "Should we step outside?" "Actually," Sarah had replied, glancing around the table with the careful assessment of someone who was beginning to understand the complex family dynamics she'd stumbled into. "Given the nature of the case and the potential connections we've discovered, it might be better if we could speak somewhere private but within the house. We may need to ask some questions." The implications of her words had settled over the dining room like a heavy blanket. Patricia had made a small sound that might have been distress, while Bob had simply stared at his daughter Rebecca as if seeing her clearly for the first time. David had looked completely lost, his gaze moving between his wife, his sister, and the police detective who had just turned his family's Sunday dinner into what was beginning to feel like the opening scene of a criminal investigation. "The living room is private," David had managed to say, his voice sounding strange and distant. "You can use the living room." As Sarah and I had moved toward the doorway, I'd caught a glimpse of Rebecca's face. She'd been staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of fear, resentment, and what might have been a dawning understanding that her cruel joke had just backfired in ways she couldn't have imagined. The woman she'd been mocking as a wannabe security guard was not only a real detective, but potentially the person investigating her employer for serious financial crimes. The plastic badge and whistle sat on the table like props in a comedy that had suddenly become a drama, and I could see Rebecca beginning to understand that her attempt to humiliate me had instead revealed connections she probably wished had stayed hidden. Walking into the Miller family living room with Detective Chen, I'd felt the weight of 3 years' worth of accumulated dismissal and condescension finally beginning to lift from my shoulders. Not because I cared about proving Rebecca wrong, but because the truth was finally coming to light in a way that would be impossible for anyone to deny or explain away. The real story was just beginning. The Miller family living room felt smaller than usual as Detective Chen and I settled into the burgundy leather chairs that Bob had been so proud of when he'd bought them 5 years ago. Through the archway, I could hear the muffled sounds of tense conversation from the dining room, punctuated by what sounded like Rebecca's voice rising in pitch before being quickly hushed by someone else. The family photos lining the mantelpiece seemed to watch us with silent judgment. Decades of Miller family gatherings frozen in silver frames that suddenly felt like evidence of a life I'd never quite belonged to. Sarah opened her notebook with the practiced efficiency that had made her such an excellent partner over the past 2 years. We'd worked together on dozens of cases since she'd transferred to the organized crime division, and I'd learned to read, her expressions like a familiar language. Right now, her face showed the careful neutrality she wore when a case was about to get complicated in ways that extended beyond the official investigation. "Before we discuss the Henderson developments," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that the family couldn't overhear from the dining room, "I need to understand what I just walked into. Your family doesn't know what you do for a living?" The question hung between us like a bridge I'd been avoiding crossing for 3 years. I'd never fully explained to Sarah why I kept my work life so compartmentalized from my marriage, why I deflected when she suggested meeting David or attending police department social events as couples. She'd always respected my privacy, but walking into that dining room and witnessing Rebecca's cruel performance had clearly shifted something in her understanding of my personal situation. "It's complicated," I began, then stopped myself. The word sounded inadequate even to my own ears, a weak excuse for what was really a pattern of allowing myself to be diminished to keep peace in a family that had never quite accepted me. "David knows what I do. He's always known." But somehow, over the years, the rest of his family convinced themselves I was something else entirely. Sarah's eyebrows raised slightly, but she didn't interrupt as I continued. "When David first introduced me to his family, I'd just made detective. I was proud of the promotion, excited about the opportunities ahead. But Rebecca, his older sister, she heard security work and immediately decided that meant I was some kind of mall security guard. Every time I tried to correct the impression, she'd dismiss it as me trying to make my job sound more important than it was." The memory of those early family dinners still stung. I remembered the condescending way Rebecca would pat my hand whenever I tried to explain the complexity of financial crime investigation, the way she'd change the subject when I mentioned training courses or certifications. She'd had this talent for making me feel foolish for even attempting to correct her assumptions, as if I were a child insisting that my imaginary friend was real. "Eventually, I stopped trying," I admitted to Sarah. "It was easier to let them believe what they wanted to believe than to keep fighting a battle I couldn't seem to win. Besides, there are operational security reasons for keeping a low profile about detective work, especially when you're working undercover operations." Sarah nodded understanding. She'd been in law enforcement long enough to know that detective work often required maintaining cover stories, even with family members. But I could see in her expression that she also understood the personal cost of living with such a significant misunderstanding of who I was and what I contributed to the community. "The woman with the plastic badge," Sarah said carefully. "That's the sister-in-law who works at Henderson Marketing?" "Rebecca Miller. She's been the family's unofficial gatekeeper since David and I got married. She decides who's worthy of the Miller name, apparently, and I've never quite measured up to her standards." The bitterness in my voice surprised me. I'd thought I'd made peace with Rebecca's treatment years ago, but having Sarah witness it firsthand had brought all those feelings rushing back to the surface. Through the archway, I could see David pacing near the dining room table, his hands running through his hair in the gesture I recognized as his response to high stress. His parents sat rigidly in their chairs, Patricia's face pale and confused, while Bob kept glancing toward the living room as if he could somehow hear our conversation through sheer willpower. Rebecca remained seated, but her posture suggested someone preparing to flee at the first opportunity. "Tell me about Rebecca's role at Henderson Marketing," Sarah said, her notebook ready. "How long has she worked there? What's her position?" I realized with some embarrassment that despite 3 years of family dinners where Rebecca dominated conversations with stories about her professional achievements, I actually knew very little concrete information about her job. She'd always spoken in vague terms about managing client relationships and developing strategic marketing initiatives, but she'd never been specific about which clients or what strategies. She's been there about 4 years, I think. She started as an account executive and got promoted to senior account executive about 18 months ago. She manages several major accounts, though she's always been secretive about the details. Claims it's for client confidentiality. I paused, remembering something that had always struck me as odd. She makes good money, though. Better money than you'd expect for marketing in a city like Riverside. Sarah made notes as I spoke, her expression growing more focused. Has she mentioned any specific clients? Any particular companies or industries she works with? She's always been vague about that. She says she works with diverse business portfolios and innovative growth companies, but she never names names. I always assumed it was because she thought we wouldn't understand the sophisticated nature of her work. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Rebecca had been condescending about my supposed lack of professional sophistication, she'd never provided any real details about her own career. What about her lifestyle? You mentioned she makes good money. Does that match what you've observed? I thought about Rebecca's designer handbags, her expensive shoes, the new car she'd bought last year with cash. David had mentioned being impressed that his sister could afford such luxuries on a marketing salary, especially since she'd only been in the industry for a few years before landing her position at Henderson. She lives well, very well. Designer, everything. Expensive vacations, always picking up the check when the family goes out to dinner. She acts like it's just smart financial planning, but David's mentioned being surprised by how much disposable income she has. Sarah's pen moved quickly across her notebook, and I could see her making connections that I was only beginning to understand. The Henderson marketing agency investigation had been focused on a sophisticated money laundering operation that used legitimate businesses to clean funds from various illegal enterprises. If Rebecca was involved, whether knowingly or unknowingly, it would explain both her financial prosperity and her secretiveness about client details. One more question. About the family dynamics, Sarah said, looking up from her notes. How does David handle the situation between you and his sister? This was the question I'd been dreading, partly because it forced me to confront my own disappointment in my husband's response to years of mistreatment. David wasn't malicious, and he wasn't intentionally dismissive of my career. But he'd also never found the courage to directly confront his sister's behavior or correct his family's misconceptions about my work. David tries to keep the peace. He knows what I do for a living. He's proud of my work. But he's never been willing to have a direct confrontation with Rebecca about her treatment of me. He always says he'll talk to her privately, but nothing ever changes. I think he hopes that if he ignores the problem long enough, it'll resolve itself. The sound of raised voices from the dining room interrupted our conversation. Through the archway, I could see Rebecca standing now, her hands gesticulating as she spoke rapidly to David. Patricia was wringing her hands, and Bob had his head in his hands as if he were trying to process information that didn't make sense. We should probably get to the Henderson developments, I said to Sarah, though part of me wanted to delay whatever news had brought her to the Miller house on a Sunday afternoon. The personal revelations were overwhelming enough without adding professional complications to the mix. Part 3. The pattern of underestimation. Sarah closed her notebook temporarily and leaned forward in her chair, her expression shifting to the focused intensity she wore when delivering significant case updates. Before I brief you on the Henderson developments, I need you to understand something, Jess. Walking into that dining room and seeing how your own family treats you, it explains a lot about why you've been so methodical and thorough on this investigation. You've been operating from a position where you constantly have to prove yourself. Her observation struck deeper than I'd expected. In the 3 years since joining the Miller family, I'd developed a heightened sensitivity to being dismissed or underestimated. Every condescending comment from Rebecca, every time Patricia introduced me as David's wife who does some kind of security work, every family gathering where my opinions were politely ignored, had reinforced a pattern of having to work twice, as hard to be taken seriously. It started before I even married into this family, I told Sarah, settling back into the leather chair as memories I'd tried to bury began surfacing. My first day at the police academy, the instructor asked who was planning to go into detective work. I raised my hand along with about 15 other cadets, but I was the only woman. He looked directly at me and said, "Young lady, detective, work isn't really suitable for someone of your disposition. Have you considered community outreach or victim services?" Sarah's expression darkened. She'd heard similar stories from other female officers, but that didn't make them any less infuriating. "What did you do?" "I graduated valedictorian and requested assignment to the most challenging district in the city." I spent 2 years on patrol in neighborhoods where half the male officers were afraid to work alone, and I never called for backup unless absolutely necessary. When detective positions opened up, I had more commendations and successful case closures than anyone else in my graduating class. The memory of those early years brought back the exhaustion I'd felt from constantly having to prove myself worthy of basic respect. Every arrest, every successful investigation, every positive evaluation had felt like a small victory against the assumption that I wasn't cut out for serious police work. But even after making detective, the pattern continued. My first partner used to introduce me to witnesses as his assistant until I started correcting him in front of suspects. Other detectives would volunteer to help me with cases they assumed were too complex for me to handle alone. I learned to be twice as prepared for every briefing, twice as thorough in every report, twice as professional in every interaction. Sarah nodded with recognition. "And then you married into a family that immediately decided you weren't professional at all." Exactly. But the Miller family dismissal was different from the police department skepticism. At work, I could prove myself through performance. I could show my competence through successful investigations and case closures. With Rebecca and the family, nothing I did seemed to matter because they'd already decided who I was. I remembered the first Christmas after David and I were married, when Rebecca had given me a gift certificate to a local community college for continuing education opportunities. She'd presented it with such sincere concern for my professional development that I'd almost believed she was trying to be helpful. It wasn't until later that I'd realized she was suggesting I needed to go back to school to qualify for real work. The worst part wasn't even Rebecca's attitude, I continued. It was watching David struggle to navigate between supporting me and keeping peace with his family. He'd defend me when we were alone, but in front of his parents and sister, he'd just stay quiet and let the implications stand. Through the archway, I could see David now sitting at the dining room table, his head in his hands while Rebecca paced behind him. Patricia was attempting to serve coffee, her movements sharp and agitated, while Bob remained motionless in his chair, staring at nothing. Last year, at David's birthday dinner, Rebecca made this elaborate toast about how proud she was of her brother for taking care of me, despite my limited career prospects. She talked about how it showed his generous nature that he was willing to support a wife who would probably never contribute significantly to their household income. The entire restaurant heard her, and David just sat there nodding like she was saying something thoughtful and touching. Sarah's jaw tightened. "How did you respond to that?" I thanked her for the kind words and changed the subject. What else could I do? If I'd corrected her, I would have looked defensive. If I'd explained my actual salary and benefits, I would have sounded like I was bragging. There was no way to respond that wouldn't have made me look worse in her narrative. The pattern had repeated itself countless times over the years. Rebecca would make assumptions about my capabilities, my income, my professional prospects, and I'd learned that any attempt to correct those assumptions would be dismissed as either defensiveness or delusion. It was easier to let her maintain her misconceptions than to engage in battles I couldn't win. But the pattern extended beyond just career dismissal, I told Sarah. Rebecca has opinions about everything, from how I decorate our apartment to what kind of car I should drive to, whether David and I should think about having children. She acts like she's the family expert on what's appropriate for people of my station in life. 6 months ago, when David and I had been looking at houses, Rebecca had actually laughed when she'd heard about some of the properties we were considering. "Oh, Jessica," she'd said with that particular combination of amusement and pity she'd perfected, "you have to be realistic about what you can afford on a security guard salary. David's being sweet, but he can't carry the entire financial burden of home ownership." The memory still stung, partly because David hadn't corrected her assumption, and partly because I'd actually started doubting whether we could afford the houses we'd been looking at. Rebecca had such confidence in her assessment of my financial limitations that I'd begun questioning my own understanding of our household budget. "The plastic badge and whistle today were just the latest escalation," I explained to Sarah. "Rebecca's been building up to something like this for months. She's been making more frequent comments about my career development and suggesting that maybe it was time for me to explore other opportunities that might be more suitable for someone with my background. Last month, she'd even brought me job listings printed from online employment sites, entry-level positions at retail stores, receptionist jobs, clerical work at small offices. She'd presented them as helpful suggestions for career transitions that might offer more stability than my current security consulting work. I think she genuinely believes she's being helpful," I said to Sarah. In her mind, she's the successful professional sister-in-law who's trying to guide her brother's misguided wife toward more realistic career expectations. She thinks I'm delusional about my own capabilities and that someone needs to help me understand my limitations. The irony was staggering. While Rebecca had been condescending to me about my supposed lack of professional sophistication, I'd been building a reputation as one of the most effective financial crime investigators in the department. While she'd been suggesting I needed to work my way up from basic security work, I'd been leading complex investigations that required advanced analytical skills and coordination with federal agencies. "The really frustrating part," I continued, "is that I've started internalizing some of her assumptions. After 3 years of being treated like I'm not quite smart enough or capable enough to understand complex professional situations, I sometimes catch myself doubting my own judgment." Sarah leaned forward with concern. "How so?" "During briefings, I'll second-guess whether my analysis is sophisticated enough. When writing reports, I'll revise them multiple times because I'm worried they don't sound professional enough. I've started being more cautious about offering opinions in meetings because I'm afraid other people will think I'm overestimating my own expertise." The admission was harder to make than I'd expected. I'd always prided myself on professional confidence, but 3 years of systematic dismissal had eroded that confidence in ways I was only beginning to understand. Rebecca's treatment has made me hyper-aware of how other people perceive my competence. I analyze every interaction with colleagues to see if they're taking me seriously or if they're humoring me the way Rebecca does. It's exhausting to constantly wonder if people see you the way you see yourself or the way your family sees you. Through the archway, Rebecca had stopped pacing and was now sitting rigidly in her chair, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Patricia was hovering near the coffee service, clearly wanting to be helpful, but unsure what kind of help the situation required. Bob had given up any pretense of understanding what was happening and was simply waiting for someone to explain the new reality to him. "The worst part about the whole pattern," I told Sarah, "is that it's made me question David's respect for me too. If he can sit there and listen to his sister talk about me like I'm some kind of charity case he's taken on, what does that say about how he really sees our marriage? Does he actually respect my career? Or is he just more polite than Rebecca about expressing his doubts?" Part 4. Escalating stakes and growing pressure. Sarah's expression had grown increasingly serious as I'd described the pattern of dismissal I'd endured from the Miller family. Now she opened her notebook again, but this time her focus seemed to be on connections between my personal situation and the professional investigation that had brought her to interrupt our family dinner. Jess, I need to tell you about the developments in the Henderson case. But first, I want you to understand something. The timing of what just happened in that dining room with Rebecca's performance and my arrival, it's not coincidence. We've been closing in on some major players in the money laundering operation, and I think your sister-in-law might be more involved than we initially suspected. My stomach dropped as the implications began crystallizing. For 3 years, I'd been enduring Rebecca's condescension about my supposed lack of professional sophistication while potentially living in the same family as someone involved in the very crimes I'd been investigating. The irony was so sharp, it almost felt like a physical pain. "What kind of involvement are we talking about?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer would complicate my life in ways I wasn't prepared to handle. "That's what we need to determine, and that's why I needed to find you immediately. We've identified Rebecca Miller as a person of interest in the Henderson marketing agency investigation. Her financial records show deposits and expenditures that don't match her official salary, and several of the shell companies we've been tracking have made payments directly to accounts associated with her name." The news hit me like a physical blow. I'd suspected that Rebecca's lifestyle exceeded what a marketing executive should reasonably afford, but I'd attributed it to good financial planning or family money I didn't know about. The possibility that her prosperity came from involvement in money laundering had never seriously occurred to me. "How long have you known?" I asked, dreading the answer. "We identified her as a person of interest 3 days ago. I was planning to brief you tomorrow morning, but then we got the warrant results this afternoon, and everything accelerated." Sarah flipped through several pages in her notebook. "Jess, she's not just connected to this operation. Based on the financial evidence, she appears to be one of the primary facilitators." The room seemed to spin slightly as I processed this information. For months, I'd been investigating a sophisticated money laundering scheme, methodically tracking financial transactions and building cases against various participants. I'd been proud of the thoroughness of my work, the careful analysis that had helped identify patterns and connections other investigators had missed. And all the while, one of the key figures in the operation had been sitting across from me at family dinners, mocking my supposed lack of professional competence. Does this mean I have to recuse myself from the investigation? The question came out more strained than I'd intended. The Henderson case had been the most significant investigation of my career, the kind of case that could establish my reputation as a detective for years to come. The thought of having to step away just as we were making major breakthroughs was almost unbearable. "That's what Captain Rodriguez and I discussed this afternoon," Sarah said carefully. "Technically, yes. You should recuse yourself from any aspects of the investigation that directly involve Rebecca. But the operation is so complex, and your analysis has been so crucial to our progress, that removing you entirely would significantly compromise our ability to build successful prosecutions against the other participants." She paused, studying my face as if trying to gauge my emotional state. "The captain wants to meet with you first thing tomorrow morning to discuss how to handle the conflict of interest. For now, we're treating this as a need-to-know situation. Rebecca doesn't know. We've identified her as a person of interest, and we want to keep it that way until we've secured all the evidence we need." The weight of maintaining this secret felt enormous. I was going to have to sit through the remainder of this family dinner, pretend that nothing had changed, and somehow act normally around a woman who was not only my primary antagonist, but potentially a major criminal in my own investigation. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice dropping even lower. "The warrant we executed this afternoon was for Henderson Marketing Agency's servers and financial records. We found evidence that Rebecca has been actively recruiting other businesses to participate in the money laundering scheme. She's not just a participant, she's been working to expand the operation." My mind raced through the implications. If Rebecca had been recruiting other businesses, she'd been actively involved in growing a criminal enterprise while simultaneously dismissing me as incompetent to understand basic professional concepts. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. How sophisticated is her involvement? I asked, dreading the answer, but needing to understand the scope of what we were dealing with. Very sophisticated. She's been using her legitimate marketing position to identify businesses with cash flow patterns that would make them suitable for money laundering operations. Then she's been approaching owners with offers for consulting services that are actually recruitment pitches for joining the scheme. Sarah showed me several pages of financial records that had been included in the warrant results. Even glancing at them quickly, I could see patterns that suggested Rebecca had been involved in laundering substantial amounts of money over an extended period. The numbers were staggering, far exceeding what any legitimate marketing consultant could earn. Based on these records, we estimate she's facilitated the laundering of approximately $3 million over the past 18 months, Sarah continued. Her personal take appears to be somewhere around $400,000 during that same period. The figure explained everything about Rebecca's lifestyle, from her designer wardrobe to her expensive vacations to her ability to pick up restaurant checks without concern. It also explained her confidence in dismissing my career prospects. She'd been making more money illegally than most people in Riverside made through legitimate employment. The question now, Sarah said, is whether she knows that you're a detective, and specifically whether she knows you've been investigating Henderson Marketing Agency. This was the question that had been nagging at me since Sarah's arrival. Rebecca's reaction to hearing about the Henderson investigation had been immediate and visceral. She'd gone pale, gripped the table, and looked like she might faint. That wasn't the reaction of someone who was merely surprised to learn that her employer was under investigation. I don't think she knows specifically that I'm the lead detective on the Henderson case, I said slowly, but she definitely knows something is wrong. Her reaction when you mentioned the investigation was panic, not surprise. Through the archway, I could see Rebecca still sitting rigidly at the dining room table, her face now flushed rather than pale, her hands moving nervously as she spoke, in rapid, low tones to David. Whatever she was saying was clearly distressing him. His expression had shifted from confusion to what looked like growing alarm. We need to be very careful about how we proceed from here, Sarah warned. If Rebecca suspects that you're involved in the investigation, she might try to destroy evidence or flee. But we also can't ignore the fact that she just spent the afternoon publicly humiliating you in front of your family. That gives us some psychological advantage. She still sees you as incompetent, which means she might underestimate the threat you represent. The tactical considerations were complex, but they were made even more complicated by the personal dynamics involved. I was going to have to investigate someone who had been systematically undermining my confidence and self-respect for 3 years. I was going to have to build a criminal case against someone who had convinced my own husband's family that I wasn't capable of understanding sophisticated professional situations. There's one more thing, Sarah said, her expression growing even more serious. The timing of Rebecca's escalation today, the plastic badge joke, it might not have been coincidental. We think someone tipped off the Henderson organization that law enforcement was closing in. If Rebecca has been getting warnings about the investigation, her behavior today might have been an attempt to discredit you preemptively. The possibility sent a chill through me. If Rebecca had known that I was involved in investigating her employer, her cruel performance with the fake security badge took on an entirely different meaning. It wouldn't have been just family condescension. It would have been a calculated attempt to undermine my credibility and authority in front of witnesses. You think she was trying to make me look incompetent in front of the family so that if my role in the investigation became public, they'd be more likely to believe I was overreaching or making mistakes? It's possible. Criminal organizations often try to discredit law enforcement officers who are getting too close to their operations. If Rebecca has been warned that a Detective Miller is leading the Henderson investigation, her reaction might have been to try to position you as someone whose professional judgment can't be trusted. The implications were staggering. For 3 years, I'd attributed Rebecca's treatment of me to simple family snobbery and professional condescension. The possibility that it had been deliberately calculated to undermine my effectiveness as a law enforcement officer added a criminal dimension to behavior I'd been trying to endure with patience and dignity. "We need to wrap up this conversation," Sarah said, glancing toward the dining room where the family's conversation appeared to be growing more heated. "But I need you to understand that everything has changed as of this afternoon. You're not just dealing with a difficult sister-in-law anymore. You're potentially dealing with a criminal who may have been actively working to compromise your professional reputation." As we prepared to return to the dining room, I felt the weight of the new reality settling over me like a heavy coat. The family dinner that had started with Rebecca's cruel joke had become the opening scene of a criminal investigation that would force me to choose between family loyalty and professional duty. The woman who had spent 3 years telling me I wasn't smart enough or sophisticated enough for serious professional work was about to learn exactly how wrong she'd been about my capabilities. Start to Part 5, The Hidden Truth, Audience Revelation. Walking back into the dining room with Sarah felt like entering a completely different space than the one I'd left 20 minutes earlier. The formal dining table that had witnessed 3 years of family gatherings now looked like a stage set for a drama none of us had anticipated. Rebecca sat frozen in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, while David paced behind her with the restless energy of someone trying to solve an impossible puzzle. Patricia had abandoned any pretense of normal hostess behavior and was standing near the sideboard, wringing her hands and staring at her daughter with an expression of complete bewilderment. Bob remained seated at the head of the table, but his posture suggested a man who had given up trying to understand the situation and was simply waiting for someone to explain what his family had become. "I think," Sarah said with professional courtesy, "it would be helpful if Detective Miller could explain her actual role with the Riverside Police Department. There seems to be some confusion about her professional background." The formal way Sarah addressed me as Detective Miller seemed to echo in the dining room, transforming the space where I'd been dismissed and diminished into something that suddenly felt official and serious. I could see Tommy straightening in his chair, his eyes bright with curiosity, while Lisa looked between him and me as if trying to piece together a puzzle she didn't have all the pieces for. "For the past 5 years," I began, my voice carrying the professional authority I'd learned to use in courtrooms and briefings, "I've been a detective with the Riverside Police Department. For the last 2 years, I've been assigned to the Organized Crime Division, specializing in financial fraud and money laundering investigations." The words hung in the air like physical objects, solid and undeniable. I watched David's face as he processed information he'd known but never heard stated so formally, saw his parents' expressions shift from confusion to something approaching awe, and observed Tommy's growing excitement as he began to understand the scope of what his family had been getting wrong about me. But it was Rebecca's reaction that confirmed everything Sarah and I had discussed in the living room. Her face had gone beyond pale to a greenish shade that suggested genuine nausea, and she'd begun breathing in short, shallow gasps that indicated either panic or the onset of a panic attack. The Henderson marketing agency investigation that Detective Chen mentioned is one of the most complex financial crime cases the department has handled in recent years, I continued, watching Rebecca's reaction carefully. "We've been tracking a sophisticated money laundering operation that uses legitimate businesses as fronts for cleaning money from various illegal enterprises." Patricia made a small sound that might have been distress or simply surprise, while Bob sat forward in his chair as if leaning in would help him better understand information that seemed to contradict everything he thought he knew about the world. "Over the past 6 months, my team has identified patterns of fraudulent transactions involving dozens of businesses throughout the greater Riverside area. The operation is highly sophisticated, involving shell companies, fake consulting contracts, and elaborate financial structures designed to obscure the original source of funds being laundered." As I spoke, I found myself slipping into the clinical, analytical tone I used when briefing other law enforcement officials or presenting evidence to prosecutors. It was a voice I'd developed through years of having to establish credibility and authority in rooms full of people who initially doubted my competence, and it felt strange to be using it in the Miller family dining room. The investigation has required extensive coordination with federal agencies, including the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We've executed multiple search warrants, conducted surveillance, operations, and built cases against numerous individuals involved in the scheme. David had stopped pacing and was now staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not surprise exactly, since he'd always known what I did for a living, but something more like recognition, as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in the context of our marriage, understanding the disconnect between the professional competence he'd always known I possessed and the family dismissal he'd allowed to continue unchallenged. As the lead detective on this investigation, I continued, I've been responsible for analyzing financial records, coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies, and building prosecutable cases against the various participants in this criminal enterprise. The work has required advanced training in financial analysis, federal money laundering statutes, and complex investigative techniques. The contrast between my actual professional responsibilities and Rebecca's plastic badge joke was so stark it felt almost surreal. While she'd been mocking me as a wannabe security guard, I'd been building federal criminal cases and working with agencies that most people only knew from television shows. The scope of the money laundering operation we've uncovered is substantial, I said, my eyes fixed on Rebecca's increasingly distressed face. We estimate that approximately $15 million has been laundered through this network over the past 3 years, involving dozens of businesses and numerous individual participants. Rebecca made a small choking sound and pressed her hand to her mouth, as if she might actually be sick. The physical manifestation of her distress was so obvious that even Patricia noticed, moving toward her daughter with maternal concern. Rebecca, "Honey, are you feeling all right? You look terrible." "I'm fine," Rebecca managed to say, though her voice was strained and higher than usual. Just surprised by all this. I had no idea Jessica was involved in such important work. The lie was transparent enough that even Bob seemed to notice something was wrong. Rebecca's reaction was far too extreme for someone who was simply learning new information about a family member's career. Her distress suggested personal stakes in the information I was sharing, a connection that went beyond surprise or embarrassment about having misjudged my professional status. The individuals we've identified as participants in this money laundering scheme, I continued, watching Rebecca's face for additional reactions, include business owners, financial consultants, and marketing professionals who have been facilitating the movement of illegal funds through their legitimate enterprises. At the mention of marketing professionals, Rebecca's remaining color drained completely from her face. She gripped the edge of the dining table as if she needed physical support to remain upright, and I could see her hands beginning to tremble slightly. Tommy, who had been following the conversation with obvious fascination, suddenly turned to look at his sister with new attention. "Rebecca, didn't you say you work in marketing? At Henderson Marketing Agency?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, though Tommy had asked it with innocent curiosity rather than suspicion. But the effect on Rebecca was immediate and dramatic. She made a sound that was part gasp and part sob, then pushed back from the table with such force that her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "I need some air," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I just need to step outside for a minute." But Sarah's voice cut through Rebecca's attempted escape with professional authority. "I'm afraid I need to ask you to remain available for questioning, Ms. Miller. Given your employment at Henderson Marketing Agency and your potential knowledge of the financial irregularities we've been investigating, you're considered a person of interest in this case." The formal language transformed the dining room into something that felt like an interrogation room. Rebecca stood frozen halfway between her chair and the doorway, trapped between her desire to flee and the legal authority that Sarah represented. "Person of interest?" David repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means," Sarah replied with careful precision, "that based on evidence we've collected during our investigation, we believe Rebecca may have information relevant to the money laundering operation we've been tracking. It also means that she's potentially involved in the criminal activity we've uncovered." The words fell like bombs in the quiet dining room. Patricia made a small crying sound and sank into the nearest chair, while Bob simply stared at his daughter, as if she'd transformed into someone he'd never seen before. "That's impossible," David said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Rebecca works in marketing. She helps businesses with advertising and promotional campaigns. She's not involved in anything criminal." But even as he spoke, I could see David beginning to make connections he'd previously missed. Rebecca's expensive lifestyle, her secretiveness about client details, her frequent references to consulting work that never seemed to involve concrete deliverables. The pieces were falling into place in ways that painted a picture none of us had wanted to see. "The evidence suggests otherwise," Sarah replied. "Rebecca Miller has received payments totaling approximately $400,000 over the past 18 months from shell companies connected to the money laundering operation. Her financial records show deposits and expenditures that far exceed her legitimate salary from Henderson Marketing Agency." The specific dollar amount seemed to hit David like a physical blow. He staggered slightly and reached for the back of his chair for support, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning understanding. $400,000? He whispered. "Rebecca, is this true?" But Rebecca had collapsed back into her chair, her entire body shaking as if she were experiencing some kind of physical shock. The confident, condescending woman who had been orchestrating my humiliation just an hour earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by someone who looked cornered and desperate. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, and she kept looking toward the front door as if calculating whether she could make it there before anyone could stop her. "Rebecca," Patricia said, her voice trembling as she moved toward her daughter. "Tell them this is all a mistake. Tell them you don't know anything about money laundering or criminal operations." But Rebecca couldn't seem to form words. She opened her mouth several times as if to speak, then closed it again, her eyes darting between Sarah's official notebook and my face. The woman who had spent 3 years lecturing me about professional sophistication and career development was now confronted with the reality that I'd been investigating financial crimes while she'd apparently been committing them. Sarah continued with the methodical precision that made her such an effective detective. "Ms. Miller, we have documented evidence of wire transfers from 3 separate shell companies to accounts bearing your name. These transfers occurred on dates that correspond exactly with your reported business trips and client meetings. The pattern suggests active participation in money laundering activities rather than unknowing involvement." The specificity of Sarah's information seemed to drain whatever remaining fight Rebecca had left. She slumped forward in her chair, her hands covering her face, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely vulnerable and afraid. David moved to stand behind his sister's chair, his hands hovering uncertainly as if he wanted to comfort her, but didn't know how to reconcile that impulse with the growing evidence of her criminal involvement. "Rebecca, you need to explain this. You need to tell us what's really been going on." When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and completely stripped of the authoritative tone she'd always used to dominate family conversations. "I never meant for it to go this far. It started as legitimate consulting work. I was helping businesses optimize their financial processes, and the money was good, better than anything I'd ever made before." Sarah and I exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of rationalization we'd heard from other participants in sophisticated financial crimes. People who convinced themselves they were providing legitimate services while participating in elaborate criminal schemes. When Did you realize the work wasn't legitimate? Sarah asked, her pen poised over her notebook. I don't know, Rebecca said, her voice breaking. Maybe I didn't want to know. The clients paid in cash, always on time, never questioned my invoices. They were grateful for the work, respectful of my expertise. It felt good to be valued for what I could do. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me. While Rebecca had been seeking professional validation through criminal enterprise, she'd been systematically undermining my legitimate career achievements. She'd been craving the same recognition and respect she'd been denying me, but she'd been willing to break the law to get it. Tell us about Henderson Marketing Agency's role in the operation, Sarah continued. Were you recruited by other employees, or did you bring the opportunity to them? Rebecca's hands were shaking as she tried to compose herself enough to answer. Mr. Henderson, the owner, he approached me about expanding our service offerings. He said there were businesses that needed specialized financial consulting, companies that operated in cash-heavy industries and needed help managing their monetary flows. Bob, who had been silent throughout most of this revelation, suddenly spoke up with the bewildered tone of someone trying to understand a foreign language. Rebecca, are you saying you knew you were helping criminals launder money? I convinced myself I was providing legitimate business services, Rebecca replied. But her voice carried no conviction. I told myself that how the clients made their money wasn't my concern. I was just helping them manage it more efficiently. The rationalization was pathetic, but it was also completely consistent with what we'd observed from other participants in the money laundering network. Educated, professional people who had convinced themselves they could participate in criminal activities as long as they maintained enough psychological distance from the source of the illegal funds. Sarah made notes as Rebecca continued her confession. How many businesses did you recruit into the operation? 12, maybe 15. I lost count after a while. Rebecca's voice was flat now, resigned to the fact that her carefully constructed professional identity was collapsing in real time. Henderson would identify potential targets, businesses with the right kind of cash flow patterns, and I would approach the owners with consulting proposals. The scope of Rebecca's involvement was staggering. She hadn't been a peripheral participant or an unwitting accomplice. She'd been actively recruiting legitimate businesses to participate in criminal activities, using her professional credibility and marketing skills to expand the money laundering network. What kind of compensation did you receive for these recruitment activities? Sarah asked. 10% of the funds processed through each business I brought into the network, plus bonuses for meeting quarterly targets. Rebecca looked up at David with an expression of desperate shame. The money was incredible, David, more than I'd ever imagined making. I bought the car, the clothes, all those dinners I paid for. I thought I was finally successful. David's face had gone through several emotional transitions during Rebecca's confession, but now it settled into something that looked like grieving, disappointment. The sister he'd admired for her professional achievements, the woman he'd held up as an example of career success, had been funding her lifestyle through criminal activity. How long has this been going on? He asked quietly. About 2 years, maybe a little longer. Rebecca's admission meant that almost everything the family had celebrated about her career success had been built on illegal activities. Her promotion to senior account executive, her financial prosperity, her confidence in dismissing my career prospects, all of it had been funded by money laundering. Patricia, who had been listening to her daughter's confession with increasing horror, suddenly stood up from her chair with surprising force. Rebecca Ann Miller, how could you do this? How could you risk everything we've worked for, everything this family stands for? The use of Rebecca's full name carried the weight of parental authority that hadn't been employed since we were children. But it also highlighted the magnitude of betrayal that Patricia was processing. Her successful, sophisticated daughter had been living a lie that threatened to destroy the family's reputation and self-image. I thought I could handle it, Rebecca said, tears finally beginning to flow down her cheeks. I thought I was smart enough to manage the risks, professional enough to maintain appropriate boundaries. I never thought it would affect the family. But her explanation rang hollow, especially given the cruel performance she'd orchestrated just an hour earlier. Rebecca had been willing to publicly humiliate me while privately engaging in criminal activities that made my legitimate police work look like amateur hour by comparison. "What about tonight?" I asked, speaking directly to Rebecca for the first time since Sarah's arrival had transformed our family dinner into a criminal investigation. The plastic badge, the jokes about mall security, the performance for the whole family. Was that part of your strategy to discredit me? Rebecca looked at me with an expression that seemed to combine genuine confusion with residual contempt. "What are you talking about? Did you know I was the detective investigating Henderson marketing agency? Was tonight's humiliation an attempt to undermine my credibility in case my role in the investigation became public?" The question seemed to genuinely surprise Rebecca. She stared at me for several long moments, as if trying to process information that didn't fit with her understanding of the situation. "You were investigating Henderson?" she asked, her voice weak and confused. "But you're just a security guard. David said you work in security consulting." The response was so authentically bewildered that I realized Rebecca genuinely hadn't known about my role in the investigation. Her cruel behavior hadn't been calculated criminal strategy. It had been exactly what it appeared to be: systematic, family condescension based on fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I did for a living. David stepped forward, his expression shifting from disappointment to something approaching anger. "Rebecca, Jessica has never been a security guard. She's been a detective with the Riverside Police Department since before we got married. I've told you this multiple times. But she always talks about security work and consulting," Rebecca protested weakly. "She never gives details about her job. She acts like she's embarrassed about what she does. Because she works undercover operations and can't discuss active investigations," David replied, his voice rising with frustrated exasperation. "Because she has professional confidentiality requirements that prevent her from talking about her cases. Because she's been trying to maintain operational security while you've been mocking her for being secretive about work." The revelation seemed to hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She stared at me with dawning horror as she began to understand the full scope of her miscalculation. For 3 years, she'd been condescending to a detective who specialized in exactly the kind of crimes she'd been committing. She'd been lecturing me about professional sophistication while I'd been building criminal cases against people like her. "Oh my God," she whispered, her face going pale again. "You've been investigating financial crimes this whole time. You've been tracking money laundering operations while you've been participating in money laundering operations," I finished for her. "While you've been recruiting businesses into criminal activities and taking a percentage of illegal funds processed through the network you helped build." The mathematical precision of the irony was almost overwhelming. Rebecca had spent 3 years telling me I wasn't sophisticated enough to understand complex financial concepts, while I'd been analyzing financial crimes that required advanced expertise in accounting, banking regulations, and federal money laundering statutes. Sarah cleared her throat, bringing the conversation back to official police business. "Ms. Miller, I need to inform you that based on the evidence we've collected and the admissions you've made this evening, you're under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and facilitating criminal enterprise." The formal language of arrest transformed the dining room completely. Patricia began crying in earnest. Bob sat in stunned silence, and David looked like he was watching his family disintegrate in real time. Tommy and Lisa had moved closer together on their side of the table, clearly overwhelmed by the dramatic turn the evening had taken. But it was Rebecca's reaction that captured my attention. As Sarah began reading her Miranda rights, Rebecca looked directly at me with an expression I'd never seen before. not the condescending pity or dismissive amusement that had characterized our relationship for 3 years, but something that looked like genuine recognition of who I actually was. "You really are a detective," she said quietly, as if she was stating a fact that required conscious acceptance. "You really have been investigating serious crimes while I've been treating you like you were. Like I was incompetent and unprofessional," I finished. "Like I was someone who needed your guidance to understand basic career concepts." Rebecca nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was the successful one. I thought I was the sophisticated professional who understood how business really worked. I thought you were naive about money and career advancement." The confession was more honest than anything Rebecca had ever said to me, but it was also devastating in its implications. She'd built her entire sense of superiority on achievements funded by criminal activity, while dismissing legitimate professional accomplishments she'd been too arrogant to recognize. "The plastic badge," she continued, her voice breaking completely. "I thought it was funny. I thought I was making a point about realistic career expectations. I had no idea I was mocking someone who could arrest me." As Sarah finished reading Rebecca her rights and began the process of taking her into custody, I found myself experiencing emotions I hadn't expected. Not triumph or vindication, but something closer to sadness. The family dynamic that had caused me so much pain had been built on layers of deception and misunderstanding that went far beyond simple professional dismissal. Rebecca had been living a double life, funding her sense of superiority through criminal activity while publicly demeaning my legitimate career achievements. She'd been projecting her own professional insecurity onto me, using condescension to mask her awareness that her prosperity was built on illegal foundations. David moved to my side as Sarah prepared to escort Rebecca from the house. "Jess, I'm so sorry. I should have defended you. I should have corrected her assumptions years ago." "You couldn't have known about the criminal activity," I replied, though part of me was still processing my own anger about 3 years of unchallenged dismissal. "But I knew what you really did for a living. I knew you were a detective, and I let her treat you like you were incompetent. I let her make you feel small when I knew how accomplished and professional you really are." David's apology was sincere, but it also highlighted the complexity of the situation we now faced. Our marriage had been damaged by years of family dynamics that we'd now learned were based partly on criminal deception. Rebecca's condescension had been cruel and unfair, but it had also been a projection of her own awareness that her professional success was illegitimate. As Sarah escorted Rebecca toward the front door, my sister-in-law turned back to look at me one final time. "Jessica," she said quietly, "I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I never understood what I was really doing. To you, I mean. I thought I was being helpful, giving you guidance about career development. I never realized I was hurting someone who was already more successful than I could ever be." The apology was inadequate given 3 years of systematics undermining, but it was also genuinely remorseful in a way that suggested Rebecca was finally beginning to understand the full scope of her behavior and its consequences. "What happens now?" David asked Sarah as they reached the front door. "Rebecca will be processed and formally charged. Given the scope of her involvement in the money laundering operation, she'll likely face federal charges as well as state charges. The investigation will continue, but her cooperation could significantly impact her sentencing." After Sarah and Rebecca left, the Miller family dining room felt like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Patricia sat sobbing quietly in her chair while Bob stared at nothing, clearly trying to process how his successful daughter had become a criminal defendant. Tommy and Lisa remained frozen at the table, too overwhelmed by the evening's revelations to know how to respond. David and I stood in the doorway between the dining room and the front hall, surrounded by the wreckage of family assumptions and professional misunderstandings that had defined our marriage for 3 years. The plastic badge and whistle still sat on the dining room table like evidence of a cruel joke, that had backfired more dramatically than anyone could have imagined. "What do we do now?" David asked quietly. I looked around the dining room where I'd endured 3 years of dismissal and condescension, where I'd been repeatedly told I wasn't sophisticated enough to understand complex professional concepts, where I'd been mocked for career achievements that were apparently more substantial than anyone in the family had realized. "Now," I said, "we figure out how to rebuild relationships based on truth instead of assumptions. And you start defending me when people question my competence, even if those people are members of your family." The conversation we needed to have about our marriage and the damage caused by years of unchallenged family dynamics would be difficult and complex. But at least now, we'd be having it from a foundation of honesty about who I really was and what I'd accomplished, rather than the misconceptions that had poisoned our family relationships for so long. The cruel joke had revealed more truth than Rebecca could have possibly intended, but the consequences would reshape our family in ways that none of us had anticipated or prepared for. 6 months after Rebecca's arrest, the Miller family dining room looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. The same oak table where she'd presented me with plastic badges and toy whistles now served as the setting for a very different kind of family gathering. This time, we were celebrating my promotion to senior detective and my selection to lead the newly formed Financial Crimes Task Force, a multi-agency unit that would coordinate complex investigations across 3 counties. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that the woman Rebecca had mocked as incompetent mall security was now being recognized as one of the most effective financial crime investigators in the region. Captain Rodriguez had personally recommended me for the task force position, citing my work on the Henderson case as exemplary of the kind of thorough, methodical investigation that complex financial crimes required. David sat beside me at the table, and for the first time in our marriage, I could see genuine pride in his expression when he looked at me. Not the polite support he'd always offered privately, but real admiration for achievements he was finally able to acknowledge publicly. The change in his behavior had been gradual but profound. After witnessing Rebecca's arrest and understanding the full scope of what he'd allowed to happen in his family, David had made a conscious effort to become the husband he should have been all along. "Tell them about the federal recognition," he said, his voice carrying enthusiasm I hadn't heard since our early dating days. "Tell them about the letter from the Treasury Department." I smiled, still somewhat uncomfortable with being the center of positive attention in the Miller family dining room, but no longer feeling the need to minimize my accomplishments to avoid making others uncomfortable. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network sent a commendation letter recognizing the Henderson investigation as a model for how local law enforcement can effectively coordinate with federal agencies on complex money laundering cases. Patricia, who had spent months processing her daughter's criminal conviction and her own role in enabling years of family dysfunction, nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. The woman who had once introduced me as David's wife, who does some kind of security work, had gradually learned to describe me accurately as a senior detective specializing in financial crimes. The change hadn't been easy for her, but she'd made the effort, and I appreciated the growth it represented. The Henderson case ended up being much larger than we initially realized, I continued, settling into the confident professional voice I'd finally learned to use in family settings. The money laundering network involved 43 businesses across 5 states, and the total amount of illegal funds processed was just over $37 million. Bob, who had struggled more than anyone else to understand how his successful daughter had become involved in such serious criminal activity, shook his head with continuing amazement. $37 million. I still can't wrap my head around numbers like that. The scope of the criminal enterprise Rebecca had been part of was staggering, but what had impressed federal prosecutors even more was the thoroughness of the investigation my team had conducted. We'd traced financial transactions across multiple jurisdictions, identified patterns that had allowed us to predict and prevent additional criminal activity, and built cases that resulted in successful prosecutions at both state and federal levels. Rebecca's cooperation was ultimately helpful, I said carefully, still navigating the delicate territory of discussing my sister-in-law's criminal activity with family members who were still processing their own feelings about her betrayal. Her detailed knowledge of the recruitment process helped us understand how the network had grown so quickly and identify other businesses that might be vulnerable to similar approaches. The cooperation had come at a price, both for Rebecca, personally, and for our family relationships. She'd pled guilty to federal money laundering charges and received a 4-year prison sentence, which was significantly reduced from what she could have faced due to her willingness to provide extensive testimony against other participants in the criminal network. But the cooperation had also meant acknowledging the full extent of her involvement and the calculated nature of her participation in criminal activities. Tommy, who had graduated from college and was now working as a junior financial analyst at a regional investment firm, leaned forward with the professional curiosity that his education had developed. Did the investigation change how local law enforcement approaches financial crimes generally? Actually, yes, I replied, pleased to discuss the broader implications of our work. The Henderson case demonstrated that sophisticated financial crimes often appear to be legitimate business activities on the surface. We've developed new protocols for identifying suspicious patterns and coordinating with federal agencies when local investigations uncover evidence of larger criminal enterprises. The professional recognition had been gratifying, but what meant more to me was the way my family relationships had evolved in the aftermath of Rebecca's arrest. David had enrolled in counseling to address his patterns of conflict avoidance and his failure to defend me during years of family gatherings. The process had been difficult for both of us, but it had resulted in a marriage that felt more balanced and mutually supportive than it had ever been before. The new task force position will involve training other law enforcement agencies throughout the region, I explained. We'll be developing standardized approaches to financial crime investigation and creating resources that smaller departments can use when they encounter cases that might be connected to larger criminal networks. Patricia smiled, and I could see her making conscious effort to engage with my work in ways she'd never attempted before Rebecca's arrest, forced her to confront her own assumptions and biases. That sounds like very important work, Jessica. I imagine it requires quite a lot of specialized knowledge. The comment might have seemed simple, but coming from Patricia, it represented significant personal growth. For 3 years, she'd dismissed my career as something that didn't require sophisticated understanding or advanced skills. Learning to acknowledge my professional expertise had been part of her own process of reckoning with how family dynamics had damaged relationships and enabled harmful behaviors. It does require specialized knowledge, I confirmed, no longer feeling the need to minimize my accomplishments or avoid discussing the complexity of my work. Financial crime investigation involves understanding banking regulations, federal statutes, accounting principles, and coordinating with multiple agencies that each have different jurisdictions and procedures. Lisa, who had married Tommy 6 months earlier and was still learning to navigate Miller family dynamics, asked the question that demonstrated how much our family conversations had changed. Do you think Rebecca understood how sophisticated your work was when she was making those comments about career development? It was a perceptive question that addressed the psychological complexity of Rebecca's behavior and its impact on family relationships. Lisa's willingness to engage directly with difficult topics reflected the more honest communication patterns we'd all been trying to develop since the crisis had forced us to confront years of dysfunction. I think Rebecca was projecting her own professional insecurities, I replied thoughtfully. She was making substantial amounts of money through illegal activities, but on some level, she knew her prosperity wasn't based on legitimate accomplishments. Dismissing my career allowed her to avoid confronting the fact that I was achieving real professional success through actual competence and hard work. David reached for my hand across the table, a gesture of support that had become more frequent and genuine since he'd begun therapy. I think she also couldn't admit that she'd misjudged you so completely from the beginning. Acknowledging your real accomplishments would have meant acknowledging how wrong she'd been about everything. The analysis was probably accurate, but it didn't diminish the personal cost of enduring 3 years of systematic dismissal and condescension. Rebecca's criminal conviction had provided external validation of my professional competence, but rebuilding my confidence and sense of self-worth had required extensive personal work that went beyond simply being proven right about my capabilities. "The plastic badge incident," Tommy said with a rueful smile. "That's going to be a family story forever, isn't it?" "Probably," I agreed, though I could finally discuss the humiliating evening without feeling the sharp sting of embarrassment and anger it had initially caused. But now it's a story about dramatic irony rather than family cruelty. Rebecca thought she was mocking someone she considered professionally inferior, but she was actually humiliating herself in front of the person investigating her criminal activities. The transformation of that painful memory into something that demonstrated Rebecca's fundamental misunderstanding rather than my inadequacy had been part of my own healing process. The cruel joke had backfired so spectacularly that it had become evidence of her poor judgment rather than my lack of competence. "What happened to Henderson Marketing Agency?" Bob asked, still trying to understand all the ramifications of the criminal investigation that had started in his dining room. "The legitimate parts of the business were sold to another marketing firm after Mr. Henderson's conviction," I explained. "The employees who weren't involved in criminal activities were able to transition to the new company. The shell companies and fake consulting operations were dissolved, and the assets were seized for victim restitution." The business consequences had rippled through the Riverside community in ways that highlighted how financial crimes affected far more people than just the direct participants. Legitimate employees had lost jobs, clients had suffered financial losses, and community trust in local businesses had been damaged. The social costs of the criminal network Rebecca had helped build extended far beyond her personal legal consequences. "Have you had any contact with Rebecca since the sentencing?" Patricia asked quietly, her voice carrying the complex emotions of a mother trying to maintain connection with a daughter who had betrayed family values and legal obligations. "Limited contact," I replied diplomatically. "She's written several letters apologizing for her behavior over the years, and I've responded to let her know that I appreciate her acknowledgement of the harm she caused. But rebuilding any kind of relationship will require time and continued evidence of genuine change." The question of forgiveness and family reconciliation was complicated by the intersection of personal hurt and professional responsibility. Rebecca's crimes had extended far beyond her treatment of me, and her victims deserved justice that couldn't be easily balanced against family loyalty. I'd testified at her sentencing hearing, providing factual information about the investigation while avoiding personal commentary about our family relationships, but the professional distance required by my role as the investigating detective made emotional reconciliation more complex. "She asks about all of you in her letters," I continued, addressing Patricia's unspoken concerns about maintaining family connections. "She's enrolled in educational programs and seems to be using her time constructively. Whether she's truly changed or just adapting to circumstances is something that will become clear over time." David squeezed my hand gently, a gesture of support for the difficult balance I was trying to maintain between personal healing and family harmony. His own relationship with Rebecca had been profoundly damaged by her criminal conviction, and his growing understanding of how her behavior had affected our marriage. But he also recognized that completely severing family ties would create additional pain for his parents. "The important thing," David said carefully, "is that we've all learned from this experience. We've learned about the dangers of making assumptions about people, about the importance of defending family members when they're being treated unfairly, and about the need for honest communication instead of avoiding difficult conversations." His words carried the weight of personal accountability that therapy had helped him develop. David's failure to defend me during years of family gatherings hadn't been malicious, but it had been harmful, and his acknowledgement of that harm had been essential to repairing our marriage. We've also learned, Patricia added with quiet determination, that success and respectability aren't always what they appear to be. Rebecca seemed like such a successful professional, but her achievements were built on criminal activity. Jessica's real accomplishments were much more impressive than anything Rebecca pretended to achieve. The comparison was stark, but accurate. Rebecca's designer clothes and expensive lifestyle had been funded by money laundering, while my modest wardrobe and careful budgeting had reflected the responsible financial management of someone building a legitimate career. The family's initial judgments about our respective professional accomplishments had been exactly backwards. The federal task force position comes with a substantial salary increase, I mentioned, still somewhat surprised by my own comfort with discussing financial success in family settings. David and I are finally looking at houses again, and this time we can afford exactly what we want without worrying about budget constraints. The house hunting comment was deliberate, a reference to Rebecca's previous assertion that I couldn't afford the properties David and I had been considering before her arrest. The same houses she'd dismissed as unrealistic for someone of my station were now well within our budget, thanks to professional recognition that had resulted in concrete financial benefits. Tommy raised his coffee cup in a gesture that seemed to encompass celebration of my promotion and acknowledgement of how dramatically family dynamics had shifted. To Jessica, for achieving success the right way, and for being patient with a family that took way too long to appreciate what we had. The toast was simple but meaningful, representing recognition that had been absent for 3 years, but was now offered with genuine respect and admiration. As we raised our cups together, I felt the satisfaction of vindication that went beyond professional achievement to include personal validation and family acceptance. The cruel joke that had been intended to humiliate me had instead revealed the truth about everyone's character and capabilities. Rebecca's plastic badge had become a symbol of her own professional fraudulence, while my patient dignity in the face of her mockery had demonstrated the kind of integrity that real success required. Later that evening, as David and I drove home, through the familiar streets of Riverside, I reflected on how completely our lives had changed since that Sunday dinner 6 months earlier. The woman who had been dismissed as incompetent mall security was now recognized as a leading expert in financial crime investigation. The family that had questioned my professional competence now celebrated my achievements with genuine pride. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Rebecca hadn't been involved in criminal activities? David asked as we pulled into our driveway. If the money laundering investigation had never intersected with our family, I think the truth would have come out eventually, I replied. Maybe not as dramatically, but at some point, Rebecca's assumptions about my career would have collided with reality. The plastic badge joke might have been the catalyst regardless, just without the criminal investigation component. David nodded thoughtfully. I'm glad it happened the way it did. Actually, the shock of learning about Rebecca's crimes forced all of us to examine our assumptions and behaviors in ways we might not have otherwise. It made the necessary changes feel urgent instead of optional. As we entered our apartment, I noticed the framed commendation letter from the Treasury Department hanging in our hallway. Official recognition of work that had once been dismissed as inadequate by people who didn't understand what I actually did for a living. The letter served as a daily reminder that competence and achievement exist independent of other people's recognition or approval. The plastic badge and whistle that Rebecca had given me as a cruel joke were somewhere in our closet, kept as evidence for potential future legal proceedings, but also as a reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change when truth finally emerged. The toys that had been intended to mock my professional inadequacy had become symbols of Rebecca's fundamental misunderstanding of reality and her own criminal liability. The Miller family's Sunday dinners continued monthly, but they were different. Now, Conversations focused on genuine interest in each other's lives rather than performative displays of superiority. Patricia asked thoughtful questions about my work and remembered details from previous conversations. Bob shared stories about interesting insurance cases he was handling, and Tommy discussed his growing expertise in financial analysis. David participated as an equal partner in family discussions rather than trying to manage everyone else's reactions. The absence of Rebecca's dominating presence had allowed more authentic relationships to develop, though her empty chair served as a constant reminder of the consequences of deception and the importance of integrity in both professional and personal contexts. The cruel joke had backfired in ways Rebecca could never have anticipated, revealing truths that transformed our family's understanding of success, competence, and character. The woman she'd mocked as professionally inadequate had been investigating financial crimes while she'd been committing them. The detective she'd dismissed as incompetent had built the case that resulted in her federal conviction. But perhaps most importantly, the humiliating evening that had felt like personal destruction had become the catalyst for building relationships based on truth rather than assumptions, respect rather than condescension, and genuine support rather than polite tolerance. The plastic badge joke had revealed everyone's true character, and in the end, that revelation had made our family stronger and more honest than it had ever been before. The vindication was complete, but it had come at a cost that reminded us all that truth and integrity matter more than temporary comfort or family harmony based on lies and willful ignorance. The detective who had been dismissed as mall security had proven her professional competence beyond any possible doubt. But more importantly, she had maintained her character and dignity throughout the process of claiming the recognition she had always deserved. 2 years after Rebecca's conviction, I stood at the podium of the National Law Enforcement Conference in Washington, D.C., delivering the keynote address on innovative approaches to financial crime investigation. The auditorium was filled with detectives, federal agents, prosecutors, and law enforcement administrators from across the country, all gathered to learn about methodologies that had emerged from the Henderson case and subsequent investigations my task force had conducted. The irony of my position wasn't lost on me as I looked out at an audience of accomplished professionals who were treating me as an expert in my field. The woman who had once been mocked with plastic badges and toy whistles was now being introduced as one of the leading authorities on complex financial crime investigation in the United States. The transformation felt surreal, but it was grounded in concrete achievements and recognition that no one could dismiss or explain away. The Henderson marketing agency investigation taught us that modern money laundering operations often hide in plain sight, disguised as legitimate business activities, I explained to the assembled law enforcement professionals. The key to identifying these schemes is understanding that criminals increasingly recruit educated, professional individuals who can provide sophisticated services while maintaining plausible deniability about the ultimate source of funds. As I spoke, I thought about Rebecca, who was now 18 months into her federal sentence and had become something of a case study in how intelligent people could be drawn into criminal enterprises through gradual escalation and rationalization. Her story had become part of the training materials we use to help other investigators understand the psychology of white-collar criminal recruitment. The participants in these schemes often begin with legitimate work that gradually transitions into criminal activity, I continued. They convince themselves they're providing professional services rather than facilitating crimes, and they use their genuine expertise to make criminal enterprises more efficient and harder to detect. The audience took notes as I described the investigative techniques that had proven most effective in uncovering financial crimes. The methodologies we'd developed during the Henderson case had since been applied to dozens of other investigations, resulting in successful prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions and the disruption of criminal networks worth hundreds of millions of dollars. After my presentation, I was approached by Detective Maria Santos from the Los Angeles Police Department, who had been working on a case that showed similarities to the Henderson investigation. "Detective Miller," your research on criminal recruitment patterns has been invaluable to our investigation. We've identified 3 marketing firms that appear to be following the exact model you described. These conversations had become routine at law enforcement conferences, but they never failed to remind me of how dramatically my professional trajectory had changed. The same analytical skills that Rebecca had dismissed as inadequate were now being sought out by investigators across the country who were dealing with increasingly sophisticated financial crimes. The key insight from our work, I explained to Detective Santos, is that these operations target people who are already successful but vulnerable to offers of exceptional compensation. They prey on professional ambition and the desire for financial security. The psychological profile we developed for recruitment targets had proven remarkably accurate across multiple investigations. Criminal organizations specifically sought out-educated professionals who had legitimate expertise but were experiencing financial pressure or career stagnation. The promise of substantial compensation for consulting work allowed recruits to rationalize their participation, while criminal enterprises gained access to sophisticated services that made their operations more difficult to detect. Later that evening, at the conference reception, I found myself in conversation with Assistant Director Jennifer Walsh from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Your task force has become the model for how local and federal agencies should coordinate on complex investigations, she told me. The protocols you've developed are being implemented nationwide. The recognition from federal law enforcement was particularly meaningful because it represented acknowledgement that my work had implications beyond individual cases or regional investigations. The investigative approaches we'd pioneered were now considered best practices for financial crime investigation, and the training materials we'd developed were being used by agencies throughout the country. We're seeing similar criminal networks emerge in every major metropolitan area, Assistant Director Walsh continued. The Henderson model appears to be spreading, but your investigative techniques are helping us identify and disrupt these operations before they become entrenched. As the reception continued, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that humiliating Sunday dinner at the Miller family home. The woman who had been introduced as David's wife, who does some kind of security work, was now recognized as a leading expert whose insights were shaping national law enforcement policy. My phone buzzed with a text message from David, who was attending his own professional conference in Chicago. Saw your presentation on the live stream. Incredibly proud of you. Can't wait to hear about the reactions when you get home. David's support had become unwavering since he'd begun addressing his own patterns of conflict avoidance and his failure to defend me during years of family dysfunction. Our marriage had been strengthened by crisis in ways that peaceful times had never achieved, and he now took genuine pride in my accomplishments rather than feeling threatened or overwhelmed by professional recognition that exceeded his own achievements. The next morning, I attended a panel discussion on interagency cooperation, where I was seated alongside directors from the Treasury Department, DEA, and Secret Service. The conversation focused on how different agencies could share information more effectively and coordinate investigations that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Detective Miller's task force has demonstrated that complex financial crimes require exactly this kind of collaborative approach, said Director James Morrison from Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Their success rate in building prosecutable cases has exceeded anything we've seen at the local level. The statistics were impressive, even to me. In the 2 years since the Henderson investigation, my task force had initiated 43 separate investigations, resulting in 37 successful prosecutions and the seizure of over $60 million in criminal assets. The success rate reflected both the effectiveness of our investigative techniques and the sophisticated nature of the crimes we were uncovering. After the panel, I was approached by Dr. Rebecca Chen, a criminologist from Georgetown University who had been studying white-collar criminal networks. Detective Miller, I'm working on a research project about professional women in law enforcement who have overcome gender-based skepticism to achieve leadership positions. Would you be willing to participate in an interview? The request was both flattering and uncomfortable, as it forced me to confront how much my experiences with Rebecca and the Miller family had been part of a broader pattern of women being underestimated and dismissed in professional contexts. My story wasn't unique. It was representative of challenges that many women faced when their competence was questioned based on assumptions rather than evidence. I'd be happy to participate, I told Dr. Chen, though I think it's important to emphasize that the recognition I've received is based on work performance rather than overcoming discrimination. The gender dynamics were certainly present, but the ultimate vindication came through professional achievement. Flying home from Washington, I thought about how to explain the conference experience to my family. The national recognition felt almost abstract compared to the very personal validation of proving Rebecca wrong about my capabilities and character. The federal commendations and speaking opportunities were meaningful, but they didn't carry the emotional weight of David's newfound respect or Patricia's genuine interest in my work. When I arrived home, I found a package waiting that contained an advance copy of a book about financial crime investigation that included a chapter about the Henderson case. The author had interviewed me extensively about our investigative techniques, and seeing my work described in academic terms felt strange but gratifying. That weekend, at our monthly family dinner, I shared news from the conference with the Miller family. The conversation had become genuinely collaborative, with everyone contributing insights from their own professional experiences rather than competing for dominance or recognition. The federal adoption of your investigative protocols is remarkable, Tommy observed, his own work in financial analysis giving him genuine appreciation for the complexity of what my task force had achieved. You've essentially created new standards for an entire field of law enforcement. Patricia, who had made substantial personal growth in learning to acknowledge my accomplishments, asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of coordinating investigations across multiple agencies. Her interest was authentic rather than performative, reflecting genuine curiosity about work she was finally beginning to understand. "What's the most significant case you're working on now?" Bob asked, though he was careful to add, "Obviously. Anything you can share without compromising investigations." The question reflected how much family dynamics had changed. Instead of dismissing my work as unimportant or incomprehensible, family members now recognized that I was involved in significant professional activities that required discretion and expertise. "We're investigating a cryptocurrency money laundering operation that appears to involve multiple international criminal organizations," I explained. "It's the most complex case we've encountered, requiring coordination with agencies in 7 different countries." The scope of current investigations demonstrated how much my professional responsibilities had expanded since the Henderson case. What had started as a local investigation of a single marketing agency had led to recognition as an expert in international financial crime, with responsibilities that extended far beyond Riverside's city limits. David smiled as he listened to my description of the international case. "Remember when Rebecca suggested you might want to consider a career transition to retail work? I wonder what she'd think about you coordinating investigations with Interpol." The reference to Rebecca's condescending career advice no longer stung the way it once had. Her suggestions about more suitable employment opportunities had become family shorthand for the spectacular incorrectness of her assumptions about my capabilities and potential. "Speaking of Rebecca," Patricia said carefully, "she's written another letter asking about family news. I think she's genuinely trying to understand what she missed about your career, Jessica." Rebecca's letters from federal prison had evolved over time from defensive justifications to genuine expressions of remorse and bewilderment about her own behavior. Her most recent correspondence included questions about my work that suggested she was finally beginning to comprehend the scope of what she'd been dismissing for 3 years. "You can tell her about the keynote address," I said. "I think it might help her understand why her assumptions were so far off base, though I suspect she's already figured out that she fundamentally misunderstood who I was and what I was capable of achieving." The conversation about Rebecca was easier now, no longer charged with immediate anger or pain, but treated as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and the importance of looking beyond surface impressions when evaluating people's worth and potential. Later that evening, David and I sat in our new house, a property we'd been able to afford comfortably thanks to my promotion and salary increases that had accompanied national recognition of my work. The house Rebecca had once dismissed as unrealistic, for someone of my station, now felt appropriately modest given our actual financial circumstances. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Detective Chen hadn't arrived when she did?" David asked as we relaxed in our living room. "The truth would have come out eventually," I replied. "Maybe not as dramatically, but Rebecca's criminal activities would have been discovered, and my role in the investigation would have become clear. The timing just made the revelation more immediate and shocking." David nodded thoughtfully. "I'm grateful it happened the way it did. The shock forced all of us to confront truths we'd been avoiding. Without that dramatic moment, we might have continued with the same dysfunctional patterns indefinitely." As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at the various awards and commendations that now decorated our bedroom dresser. The Treasury Department Citation, the Police Department's Medal of Excellence, the certificate from the International Association of Financial Crime Investigators recognizing my contributions to the field. Each award represented professional validation that no one could question or explain away. But perhaps more meaningful was the framed photo from our most recent family gathering, showing all of us laughing together around the Miller family dining table. The same table where Rebecca had presented her cruel joke now served as the setting for genuine celebration and mutual respect. The transformation of family dynamics felt more significant than any professional recognition because it represented personal relationships rebuilt on foundations of truth and authentic appreciation. The plastic badge and whistle that had been intended to humiliate me were stored in a box in our closet, kept as evidence, but also as reminders of how completely circumstances could change when people's true character and capabilities were revealed. The toys that had symbolized Rebecca's contempt for my supposed inadequacy had become artifacts of her own spectacular misjudgment. The cruel joke had backfired beyond anything Rebecca could have imagined, revealing not just her criminal activities, but her fundamental inability to recognize competence and achievement when they didn't conform to her preconceived notions. The woman she'd mocked as professionally inferior had been investigating financial crimes while she'd been committing them, building a career based on legitimate expertise while Rebecca's apparent success had been funded by illegal activities. The vindication was complete and undeniable, grounded in professional accomplishments that had gained national recognition and family relationships that had been rebuilt on foundations of respect and truth. The detective who had been dismissed, as mall security had proven her worth beyond any possible doubt, not through anger or confrontation, but through patient competence and unwavering integrity in the face of systematic dismissal. The transformation from underestimated daughter-in-law to nationally recognized expert had taken time and persistence, but it had ultimately demonstrated that authentic achievement and character matter more than other people's limited perceptions or cruel assumptions. The woman who had endured 3 years of condescension was now setting national standards for financial crime investigation, and the family that had once questioned her competence now celebrated her success with genuine pride and understanding. The cruel joke had revealed everyone's true character, and in the end, character had proven to be the most important factor in determining who succeeded and who failed when truth finally emerged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.